Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special Devex online event, Scaling Nutrition, Advancing the Conversation. My name's Richard Jones, Editorial Director at Devex, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, this autumn, with support from the Eleanor Crook Foundation, Devex launched a series on scaling nutrition interventions, drawing on insights from professionals across the field and working in tandem with the activities of a Scaling Nutrition Community of Practice working group. This series aims to highlight tensions in the nutrition sector, particularly around the push for multisectoral solutions, as well as best practices when designing for scale. So just why have so few nutrition interventions achieved scale, and what needs to change in order to reach the global goal of ending malnutrition by 2030? To answer those questions and more, today we've gathered a set of experts well positioned to speak on the issue and to move the conversation forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce your panelists today. Drawing on over 13 years of program management experience, we're pleased to welcome Deborah Nieja, Program Manager of Rise Nutrition at Helen Keller International. Welcome, Deborah. We're also pleased to welcome Deborah. Hi. We're also pleased to welcome Dr. Habtamo Fekado, Director of Nutrition at Save the Children. Habtamo has a background in pediatric medicine and nutrition, as well as expertise in multisectoral nutrition programming. And the focus of his current work is development-related nutrition. Welcome, Habtamo.
Thank you very much.
And finally, we'd like to welcome Dr. Ellen Pitfalls, who leads the Nutrition Strategy Evidence to Action Initiative at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ellen has shaped and managed a diverse portfolio of nutrition-related grants over the past 12 years at the organization, and we're delighted she could join us for today's event. Hi.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, before we get started, everyone, a few housekeeping issues for our listeners today. If you have any problems hearing or viewing the presentations, please send a message using the Q&A chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and one of my colleagues on tech support will do their best to assist you. Likewise, if you'd like to pose a question to our panelists, please feel free to submit one using that same Q&A chat box, and we'll get to as many as time allows during the audience Q&A. Finally, a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slide deck will be sent to all registered attendees after the event. And you can also join the conversation online on social media using @Devex and the hashtag #ScalingNutrition. Now, we've asked each of our panelists to prepare a brief presentation on their area of expertise as it relates specifically to scaling nutrition programs. So to start us off, let's hear from Deborah Nieja from Helen Keller International. Deborah, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Deborah Nieja, have been introduced already, and I want to share our experience on scaling nutrition program. I'm representing from Helen Keller International in Tanzania. So outline of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit of our experience on designing for scale, challenges to scaling, what to consider for scaling, and a message for donor. I'll have a message for donor and program partners on what to consider when they are supporting scaling up efforts. So on designing for scale, based on our experience, and I think it's experience of many people, we need to consider holistic strategic plan with all the stakeholders. This is very key because at the end, you want everyone to support the program and you want it to be holistically implemented. Most of the time, people come with their program, maybe their own perspective, engaging few people, but forget key important people. For example, good engagement with the government is very key, but most of the time, people people maybe forget to engage government at all levels. The other thing is engagement of community members. Most of the time, we as programmers, we plan for communities, but we don't engage them in the process of planning. But this is very key if we want to have successful scaling project. And what's to consider, again, my point number 2 is don't introduce new system that won't be sustained beyond your program. And I don't say only new system, but new and very expensive system, because at the end of the day, you might want your program to be sustained by the government. So you should not introduce system that won't be sustained beyond your program, because it will be a worse. Because at most of the time, we want projects that can be implemented at the scale, but also sustained for a long period of time to bring the outcome that we wanted. And when you're designing for scale, also you should allow flexibility to adapt to cultural and geographical differences. This is very important. And you should do this when you plan for scale to do your robust monitoring and evaluation that will help you to continue learning. And when you learn, you can see what to adopt. Because without monitoring, you might not learn something. When you want to scale, it means maybe you have tested that innovation in one area and you want to scale in another area. So you need robust monitoring that will tell you in this area what works and what won't. So I'm having example here of Tanzania. This is pictures of one particular zone in Tanzania. So you might see we are having a very different geographical areas, but this is one zone. And if you have implemented your pilot project maybe in the right greener area, maybe whatsoever you have implemented there won't be visible or won't be implemented in and have a very good outcome in the left dry area. So you really need to learn and have flexibility to adopt what you're learning throughout the process. And what are some of the challenges that we faced and that we have overcome when we are planning for scale? We know scaling is very expensive and it requires long-term commitment. So for example, in Tanzania, every geographical unit is very huge. And if you want to scale, you will need a lot of financial and human resource to be able to do that. And this is the challenge because, as we know, donors most of the time fund maybe 5 years or at maximum 6 or 7 years. But when you want to do successful scaling, maybe you'll need more than that. So financial resources is most of the time challenging to scaling. And a challenge number 2 is an equal distribution of capacity between geographies. We know we depend on people to implement programs. So if you don't have the capacity you want, whenever you want to implement, it means you will need to invest more to build those capacity before they can be able to implement your intervention. And I'll take you back to our experience in Tanzania. Tanzania is very huge. And you might find there are those areas where we have so many partners, and those people from there are very well exposed to different methods, to different training, and maybe they are well off. But we have those areas where we don't have partners, and those are rural areas, maybe not good, even good healthcare workers, not good agriculture extension offices. So if you want to scale in these different geographies, you might meet the unequal distribution of capacity. And maybe from there, you might find maybe scaling from one geographical region to the other, maybe one is expensive and one is not. The other challenge is competing local priorities, which may hinder consistency. You might find you're implementing in one area, but also they have a lot of priorities. So this is why in my first slide, I say strategic planning and holistic strategic planning is key, because at the strategic planning, you will learn what are those local priorities, and you will try to fit in your intervention within those, or they should understand your priorities from the beginning so that they will support your interventions. And another challenge to scaling nutrition in our experience is no clear guideline, especially to scale multisectoral intervention. I know as a country in Tanzania, we have made a very good progress in doing multisectoral nutrition. But we as nutritionists, we know that we are very good in nutrition specific, but maybe not so good in nutrition sensitive intervention. And we don't know how to reap or to harvest more from nutrition sensitive sectors so that it will give us the outcome we want from nutrition specific sector. So we need to continue learning, and in the process, maybe we'll overcome this challenge. So what should the other consider? So if you want to scale intervention, you should consider engagement of key stakeholders, especially government and the communities from the beginning. They should be part and parcel of your planning so that they take ownership. And the other point is the institution that you want or you envision to sustain your program should be in the driver's seat from the beginning. So this is very key, and because at the end, if you're implementing a 5-year program, you would want it to be sustained for a longer period of time for it to have an impact. So if you're implementing without that institution that should sustain, then it won't reap you the result that you want. So that specific institution should be in the driver's seat from the beginning. You should nurture them in the process so that they get used to implementation before your funding ends. And the other point is people should not compromise quality for coverage. We know scaling is expensive, and you know maybe some of the intervention are expensive, but you should not jump in and scale your intervention in big area when you know your capacity is not there. It's better to do it in a small area that you can do it very well. So quality is very key in whatsoever we want to implement. And you should ensure that they respond to your community need. And what also to consider is simplicity of your intervention package. I know this is a bit challenging because things to do with nutrition are mostly multisectoral. Multisectoral means you engage a lot of sectors. So how are we making our intervention simple to be able to be rolled out by normal people like healthcare worker, those normal people at rural area, to be able to take our intervention and implement in our context? We really need to ensure we are simple. I know this is challenging for my fellow nutritionists who know even our messages are very long. Even when someone reads, it's sometimes very confusing. So we really need to be simple for us to be able to get the outcome we want in nutrition. And a message for donors and other program partners, my message is for them to maintain a commitment for a sufficient period of time to make an impact. So if you want to fund or if you're working on an area, do it for a sufficient period of time for you to see impact of what you're doing. And program should be tied to institution, if it's donors or if it's NGO and not individual. This help in case we have staff turnover, because sometimes you have staff turnover maybe in a donor community, and you find there is no one to continue kind of provide that strategic support to the implementing institution in the country. So it's good to maintain commitment, but it's also good to have the institutional memory so that things can continue, things can be scaled up. And the other point is flexibility is key. This is for the part of the donors to accommodate key important adjustment as needed, because some of the donor will give you money and say, this is all that you have. But when you go to contextual reality, you find you need to adapt a lot of things. And maybe those adaptations are very costly. So at the end, you might fail to reach to your end time goal because maybe you didn't have funding to tackle one simple problem that was there as a bottleneck to your success. So flexibility is key to be able to allow adaptations. Thank you so much. I end my presentation with a quote from Helen Keller. Although the world is full of suffering, it's also full of overcoming it. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Deborah, for those words as well at the end. I'd now like to give the floor to Save the Children's Dr. Habtamu Fekadu, Habtamu, thanks again so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. So my name is Habtamu. So I manage two large-scale USAID projects in Ethiopia, an engine project in gross nutrition, and also I'm going to share to you a program that we have been working with governments in Cambodia and Ethiopia. So the first project is funded by USAID. Its name is Engine, and its follow-on project is Gross Nutrition. This is to show that it's a multi-sectoral nutrition project. Those projects are being implemented at a large scale. Right now, they are implemented in 100 districts. We call it waradas in Ethiopia, and reaching around 2,000 rural villages, and I think they are called Kabbalists in Ethiopia. So this is just to show you how large scale and multi-sectoral these two projects are. And we have also a project in Cambodia. It's also another large scale multi-sectoral nutrition project on nutrition, agriculture, cash transfer, and wash. It's being implemented in 550 to 55 rural communities in 3 provinces. I'm going to share also based on the experience from Ethiopia in terms of scaling up nutrition projects. In 2007 and 2008, when I was in Ethiopia, I was working with the government to design the first multi-sectoral national nutrition program. At the time, there were only there were 40 districts that were implementing community-based IYCF nutrition services at the time. But in 2019, right now, more than 500 districts are implementing some form of IYCF project. So what I'm going to share is based on the experience we have in Ethiopia and Cambodia. So this is a slide that shows from Spring. I took it from Spring about Scaleup framework. So I think this will be further explained by Helen later. But I think there are 3 types of scale up. There are vertical scale up, either from the global to the community level, and there is a horizontal scale up, which is by the different groups, or it can be a functional scale up between different sectors. But when we consider scale up, I think we need to consider efficacy, is it cost effective, the cost efficiency, is it equitable, is the quality compromised, or is it the quality that's acceptable? And this is sustainable. These are the components of scale. It's not only increasing coverage, but I think programs should ensure efficacy, equity, quality, and sustainability. So based on our experience in Ethiopia and Cambodia and other countries too, I think there are several opportunities for scale up. So one is it's important to have political commitment, leadership, and good governance. So I think both in Ethiopia and Cambodia, I think we help the government to scale up, multi-sectoral nutrition projects through the health system and agriculture system mainly, is because of the huge commitment from the government. If I give an example from Ethiopia, they have a multi-sectoral national nutrition program, and the health system is committed to, deliver nutrition services to the community level. So it's important to have that commitment. Otherwise, we can scale up as an implementing partner, but it's not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to be maintained with good quality. The other one I think we need to consider is the consensus on evidence-based intervention. So this is really important. I think for the health system, it's clear, but for nutrition-sensitive sectors like agriculture and wash, I think we struggled a lot to define what are the evidence-based intervention. I think right now we have some evidence for some interventions, but I think this is also critical because it increases the acceptability by the government to scale it up to the next level. So this is also critical for scale up. I think the other important lesson that we learned is I think the most important factor for scale up is countries who have an existing decentralized government health and agriculture system. It's much easier to scale up programs. I think this is really important because, for example, I think in Cambodia, we use the existing community network to scale up nutrition program in the 555 villages. In Ethiopia, we used the government health extension and the agricultural extension program to scale up both nutrition sensitive and specific programs. So this is important because one, because we can reach many villages. Two, it's not that much expensive if it was implemented by only implementing partners, which is going to be expensive. So using existing system is critical. The other one is, I think, a strong civil society, community-based organization networks are also very critical for scale-up nutrition programs. So I think Save the Children has been working with local organizations for many years. So both in Ethiopia and Cambodia, we are using community-based organization, especially for social behavior change activities. The other one is, I think, existing services and programs. So, for example, I think using the antenatal care, during integrated case management, these are existing programs. So how can you use those platforms to integrate nutrition in those programs so that we can reach more people with good quality of program? The other one is, I think, to have a standardized and integrated training and social behavior change materials are also critical because if different partners are using different materials, so scale up will be very challenging by the government or local organizations. So standardizing the approach and the tools are also as critical. And the last one is the coordination between development partners, including donors, are important because sometimes you get projects in one area that are similar, funded by different donors. So having the coordination platform helpful, and that's really helpful in Ethiopia to increase the coverage of and scale up a nutrition program in Ethiopia. In terms of the process for scale up, I think Deborah mentioned, I think we need to consider scale from day one, because I think as an implementing partner, we can show how to do it, but we can't, continue to implement for years. So I think we need to make sure that we have to consider it from day one, but at the same time for donor, it's good to give, the first 6 months or 1 year to negotiate with the government, local organization to make sure scale up is considered. The other one is important to our scale up should focus on institutions rather than implementing partners, but institutions can be formal or community institutions, and they are very helpful for scale up. So that's what we use in Ethiopia and Cambodia. The other one is, in a country like Ethiopia where we have 900 districts, I don't think government, even implementing partner can reach every household. So I think it's sometimes important to use a model-based approach so that we create model or sites that are be used as a learning site for scale up to other communities and sectors. And that's what we used, I think, in Ethiopia, and we are using that to some extent for our new project in Tanzania. The other one, I think, was already mentioned by Deborah, is we have to simplify the scalable intervention, but not only the intervention, but the delivery platforms. Because you can have a very simple intervention, but if the delivery platform is complicated, it will affect the scale up. The other lesson I think we need to learn is usually in most countries, the health system is leading nutrition. So when we try to scale up nutrition program in other sectors, I think we have to consider, we shouldn't apply the health system approach for those sectors. I think we have to understand their peculiarities and adapt to the new context. So a good experience is when I started managing the engine project, we thought the agricultural extension program is a good platform to reach, to implement nutrition specific activities. And we trained several ag extension workers, but it didn't work because we didn't understand at the time their mandate, their accountability, their responsibility, and their other priorities. So we had to redesign our approach and make it specific and applicable for ag extension workers. The other, I think, important thing for process scale-up is I think we need to align with government sector priorities. So in Cambodia, I think this is important. If it's not aligned, I don't think government will invest time and resource and measure it also. So I think it's good to have that kind of alignment with government priorities. So it was easy in Ethiopia to scale up nutrient sensitive agriculture because we use an existing government safety net program called Product Safety Net Program and Agricultural Growth Program, which are priorities for the government to scale up intervention. In Cambodia, a cash transfer program is a priority for the government, so that's why we try to include nutrition in the cash transfer program. The other important for scale up is I think we need to find high-level government and civil societies who can be champions. I think we use that in Ethiopia to scale up programs. And the last one probably is, I think as an implementing partner, I think we have to trust government partners and local organizations to lead the scale-up process. I understand, it takes time. It may not align with the project time period because we have shorter time period, but they are essential for scale-up, equity, and sustainability. So there are several challenges, but I'll mention a few of them as challenge. One is most of the projects don't have, the flexibility and the time, the resource to address, scale up, equity, and quality. So that's really a big challenge which we need to work and how we can address it. And sometimes, I share our experience in Cambodia and Ethiopia, but we are not really documenting the process of the scale up, and that's, I think, one of the limitations. The other one is, I would say, is few sectors, scale up nutrition intervention earlier as compared to other sectors. So most countries, because the Ministry of Health is the lead, they can easily scale up nutrition intervention because they have a system. But some sectors, they are new to the scale up. So I think we need to give them time. But it's gonna be this is one of the challenges we face. And the other one is, I think, is scaling up, isolated nutrition communities by government has been a challenge for us. I think more work is needed how governments can scale up community-based social behavior change, because most of the nutrition scale up are related to behavior change at the community level. The last slide I have is whether, multisectoral approach is an opportunity for scale up or it's complicating scale up. I think I strongly believe that multisectoral approach facilitates scalability, provided that, we consider the following issues. One is, rather than investing more resource time to support coordination platforms, I think we are investing a lot of time to coordinate different sectors through coordination meetings. It's good to emphasize more identifying adaptive, acceptable, manageable by a specific sector. What I mean is it's better to focus on a specific sector and invest on the sector to integrate nutrition and scale up rather than make sure that different government sectors work together. And the second one is identify and invest in a few sectors that have decentralized system and whose return to nutrition investment is high. I think we have to be selective. We can't work with different sectors for scale up. So I think we need to identify which sectors are the right sector for scaling up nutrition project. And definitely Deborah and I mentioned, existing service programs and delivery programs are critical. The most important is for multi-sectoral approach to help scalability, the government should be committed and there should be established accountability. Otherwise, the potential benefit of multi-sectoral approach is really minimal. And lastly, I think we have to avoid or minimize the risk implementing vertical nutrition program unless it's absolutely necessary, because this will not facilitate scale up on nutrition program in many countries. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Habtamu. Finally, I'd like to pass the baton to the Gates Foundation's Dr. Helen Keller. Helen, a warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. I'd like to start my presentation by thanking Devex and the Eleanor Crook Foundation for hosting this really interesting online conversation. The discussion started with the opinion piece that's illustrated here, and I hope that it will continue onwards since there's so much to talk about. So reflecting on the presentations that were just made, I'm going to share my thoughts from the global perspective. I've worked in the field of nutrition for many years as a technical advisor and now for a funding organization, but I haven't worked directly facing the day-to-day challenges of program delivery. So I'll bring this to have a somewhat global perspective. And so I see the conversation as one about tensions, and there are tensions between scale and impact, where I think it's pretty safe to say that impact at the population level requires scale, without a doubt, but achieving scale does not automatically translate into impact. So I wanted to frame my points or my conversation in around three themes, and I'm calling them tensions, but they're really challenges. The first tension is the tension created by when we conceptualize the issue in terms of scaling interventions or inputs, but not in terms of scaling impact. The second is about we know that we have to strengthen systems and capacity. We heard that in the prior presentations, but there is a strong push to show results in all of our programs. I call this counting lives saved, but it could be many different outcomes. The idea is pushing for results rather than focusing on systems. And then finally, there's a tension that exists when we're trying to address really complex problems like malnutrition that have social, economic, cultural, and physical health manifestations, and we're looking for simple solutions that can be scaled and are affordable and can be sustained. And this is a big challenge for nutrition. So like all things in nutrition, I think it's really important to put these tensions into context. And since I sit in the United States, which is far away from the programs and the real challenges, I consulted a number of colleagues working in the field, and I posed to them a few questions. I asked, what are nutrition's unique challenges? Why have relatively few programs gone to scale? And a prevailing theme of this series is, do multisectoral approaches complicate the pathways to scale, which we just heard about very nicely from Dr. Haptamu. My slides summarize what I heard, as well as what resonated from my personal perspective. And I'll highlight a few points, but quite a few of them have already been made by the previous speakers. And then I'll move on to the tensions. So I think we're all aware of the unique challenges that nutrition faces, and some of them summarized here. Among them is the fact that nutrition isn't a sector. There's no Ministry of Nutrition anywhere, and this makes it really hard to pinpoint who's accountable for nutrition results. Many nutrition interventions, as we just heard, require modifying ingrained beliefs and daily practices. And this calls for social and behavior change. We all know it's hard to influence and sustain behavior change, particularly when it comes to what we eat in our diet. Malnutrition problems occur throughout the life cycle. They don't happen just once, and they involve many different outcomes. So there's quite a number of different interventions, and this creates a big challenge. In its most prevalent forms, malnutrition is invisible. Its consequences are subtle. And this tends to translate into a lack of urgency at many different levels. And then finally, I think more so than in other fields, we've heard that a lack of data on coverage of important interventions is a big challenge. We don't have the data. If the question's about scaling, we often simply don't know who's being reached and who's being left behind. The previous speakers called out many of the challenges to going to scale here, so I'll try to be quick. It's suffice it to say, we heard that planning for scale has to happen up front. It can't be an afterthought. If scaling the inputs or interventions takes time, scaling the impact takes even more time. We heard also that funders are looking for quick wins and scaling, and that creates a challenge. We tend to, in programs, test what I call the Cadillac models in order to be able to show that you get results. And we tend to deprioritize research that focuses on identifying the core components and the adaptations that are needed that you just can't do without. You can't subtract out, if you will, when interventions have to be adapted and replicated and scaled. We don't have robust cost data. This complicates budgeting for scale-up and resource mobilization. And the reality is that there's no dedicated financing mechanism for nutrition, so raising resources for nutrition is more complicated than in some of the other sectors. And to the critical question of does multisectoral approach complicate or limit the pathways to scale, one of my key informants working on the Suhara project, which is a USAID-funded program in Nepal, said exactly this. It's pretty much a direct quote. Yes, it does if we're thinking about the challenge from an academic, implementation, or donor perspective. But no, it doesn't if we're thinking about it from a community's perspective. She reminded us that people don't think in sectors or compartments, and that everything actually ultimately gets integrated at the household and the community level. So it is important to keep that in mind, and Dr. Haptamu made those points very well. So now on to the three questions or the three tensions that I mentioned. On the first, which speaks to the last question about multisectorality, whether these approaches complicate pathways to scale, I would say that the answer to this question is really different if you're thinking about framing the issue as scaling impact as opposed to scaling interventions. We know that durable reductions in malnutrition require change and delivery through multiple channels. These channels are governed by different sectors, as we heard. So inherently, we also need strategies that are multisectoral. Large-scale staple food fortification is one example of this, but there are several. And for the last 6 years, we've been talking about nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions. And this language has helped us, it served us well over time because it did bring in the other sectors. But it may actually, I think, be time to move on and get more specific about what we mean, what we want each sector to do, what they should be responsible for, what they should be taking on. How, when, and where. And I think that comment was also made by my other presenters. And I just want to say that some of us are working on trying to reframe or create a new framework that makes this much more explicit. And hopefully in 2020, this will be coming out and shared for feedback. So please stay tuned for that. On the tension around focusing on system strengthening versus counting lives saved or achieving a specific outcome, I'll just mention two things. First is that a lot of intervention research gets designed only to measure outcomes, that is, Z-scores attained or gained or lives saved. And too many of the how things around implementation are never measured or documented. There's a large body of evidence from initiatives such as IFPRI Stories of Change and many others, including what we just heard, that look at the factors contributing to impact at scale. And these are summarized here. And I think many of these ideas were spoken to by both Deborah and Haptamu. We had a session at the Sun Global Gathering last month, and some of these lessons were discussed. And one of the interesting things that was observed is that not many of these particular critical success factors actually have to do with the technical interventions that we tend to study in implementation research. They actually have to do with the processes of scaling and engaging stakeholders, communities, and so on. So whereas the right intervention almost certainly varies by context, these critical how factors, critical success factors for scaling impact seem to be pretty universal across programs and countries. And now for my last tension, which is around complexity and simple solutions. We heard others say quite clearly that multisectoral engagement can't be an end unto itself. It has to be strategic and it has to be specific. We have to make it doable, create standard operating procedures. That's what I call the SOPs that say what we want the different sectors to do. Only by doing this will this be durable to change. Deborah mentioned change in institutions and individuals and donors, people working in the funding side, but also changes in governments. Unless we make very specific what every sector is expected to do and have that quite clear, it won't be durable and lasting through change. One can't boil the ocean, as they say. It's not a theory of everything, as I think one of the opinion pieces stated. And so one approach is to focus on the important opportunity gaps, and this is where a delivery platform exists that's reaching a population, as Optimus said, but relevant nutrition interventions are not. And antenatal care is a good example of a delivery platform that exists where you could actually focus on scaling up nutrition interventions and have quite an impact. So it's a good place to start. Designing with scale in mind at the outset has been mentioned by everyone, so I won't dwell on it here. And then it's really critical, as someone also said, to embed lean monitoring into programs. We actually have to know not just about coverage, but about effective coverage, delivery with sufficient quality to achieve impact. We don't know how to do this yet, so this needs to be a priority going forward to figure out how to embed lean monitoring about effective coverage into programs. And without this information, we say we're flying blind, so it is a priority going forward. Finally, I always like to end my remarks with something positive, and much of this discourse has been about challenges. So this slide offers two examples of large-scale programs that have delivered impact in nutrition. The first one is Alive and Thrive, which is an initiative I know very well. It started as a proof of concept investment to demonstrate that innovation and impact at scale could be achieved for infant young child feeding interventions. It was multisectoral in that it focused largely on social and behavior change, but delivered through multiple platforms. Sustainability was considered from the beginning in addition to scale, and it is one of the few large-scale programs where follow-up studies have actually been done to assess delivery fidelity and impact after the proof of concept phase ended and the scaling continued to be taken on locally and financed locally as well. And then the Suhara project in Nepal is now in its second phase. It's funded by USAID, as I mentioned earlier. It's a multisectoral program that has very strong monitoring embedded within it. And this paper that I have pasted here illustrates reports on impacts in phase one. I'm less familiar with the program, but it suggests that learning more about how they embedded monitoring into the program and how they learned from it might be a good topic for future conversations on this theme. And I'd like to thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks for that insight, Ellen. And we'll soon take some questions from the audience, and we'll get to as many as time allows. But first, I wanted to turn back to you, Ellen. You've just mentioned Alive and Thrive as a case of scale being achieved, as well as the USAID program in Nepal. I just wondered, from your experience, are there any common pitfalls that nutrition programs encounter while attempting to scale?
Yeah, that's a great question, and perhaps my colleagues are even better placed to answer that. But from my kind of funding and technical perspective, I think that some of the pitfalls that I mentioned before apply here. One is the time frame question, is really trying to do things too quickly, not paying enough attention to getting stakeholder buy-in, getting input, designing a program that can be adaptable and meets the needs of the local circumstances, and complexity, creating too much complexity that can't actually be delivered. So those, to me, are the common pitfalls. Of course, financing and funding for the programs is also a challenge in this arena.
And talking about complexity, I mean, in your experience, does a multisectoral approach complicate or limit the pathways to scale? Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that issue.
Yeah, I think if we say a multisectoral approach for the sake of having a multisectoral approach, then yeah, that may make it a little complicated. I think Optimus said that in his remarks, and I'll let him speak to it more, is that if we focus so much on the creating the platforms and the multisectoral discussion, then it can become complicated. I think that if we take a different path and think about what we want and what each sector needs to do and be accountable and define it in concrete and doable ways, then I think it becomes much more more realistic, and I would argue it's actually quite essential. And I loved what was said by, I think, Abdamu and as well as Deborah, that, you know, we can't, it's not an either or. I think we have to engage other sectors. We have to make it concrete and doable, and there needs to be accountability and measurement.
Exactly. And so looking ahead, what's your sense of how we as a community, where we stand today, where we can learn from our historical achievements, and perhaps what's one thing that we could be doing better in the future to better achieve this goal of impact at scale?
Ooh, that's a hard question. The one thing question. Well, I think, first of all, it's really great to have these dialogues, and I think it's really, really important we can do a great job in the future, or a better job in the future, of learning from the experiences in the field and paying a lot more attention to the how challenges and taking those how challenges seriously, and not spending so much time at the global level debating, you know, whether or not one intervention is better than another, or whether or not, and I don't mean this, you know, that we need a multisectoral approach or not. I think we need to discuss really and realistically how do we achieve success involving multiple sectors and the challenge of ending malnutrition in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Richard, can I add?
Yes, of course. Abdamu, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Helen said, I think the other areas probably what we need to do is, one is documenting the scale. I think we scaled several programs, but I think, you know, we need to make sure that, you know, there is a clear indicator for it and how we monitor it. That's one thing to look into. And the other one is, I think, when you consider, you know, scale, I think we are focusing on reaching many households or large geographic areas, but I think we are missing the equity issue. We are missing the sustainability and quality issue. I think these are some of the areas probably we need to do more, and we need to have a global conversation on. Is some of the things I think to flag from my side.
And perhaps things to be kept in mind from the start of a project. Perhaps, Deborah, I could bring you in at this point and ask, when you are designing for scale, what are some of the key things to keep in mind? So things to think about from the outset. The subject of a recent piece as part of our Scaling Nutrition series.
Okay, thank you. I think I talk much about that, and as my colleagues say, I think from the start you need to engage your key stakeholders. You need to engage to ensure everyone is there in the table. But I like what Abdam say, like you need also to scale what is priority for the country, what is priority for that state. Because in so doing, you will have like needed support that you want, not only to scale, but also it will be able to be sustained beyond the funding that you have. So to me, I think engagement is key. And one thing that I'll say based on a presentation that I had recently is ensuring that you're scaling something which is simple. And this, I think, is a challenge now when we talk about multisectoral issues, where we want every sector to kind of contribute toward nutrition out. I'll give an example of Tanzania. When we say sector, 9 ministries. So you imagine engaging all the 9 ministries to be able to respond to nutrition. Maybe that's a little bit delayed, but we need to plan and we need to see who we should engage at the beginning and who we should engage at which level so that we reach our end goal.
I think we're having a few audio problems here, Deborah. I'm not sure if it's the case for all of our audience, but maybe we can come back to you shortly. Habtamu, perhaps I could turn back to you just to give us your sense of the main outstanding challenges here to launching multisectoral nutrition interventions. What's your ingredient for success here?
I think, for Multisectoral, as I said, I think in countries where we work at, where there is a multisectoral approach is a government priority, it's much easier to launch a multisectoral nutrition project. That's one. Two is, I think, Ellen also mentioned, is we need to simplify nutrition for non-traditional nutrition actors, sectors, I mean. So I think, as I gave the example earlier, we try to scale up all nutrition-specific interventions through agriculture extension program because we thought the coverage is big. But I think it was a wrong decision. So I think, one of the things to simplify, as I said, is for multisectoral is, I think we need to simplify nutrition for other sector, but this should not be done by nutritionists. We can help, but it should be done by people who are working in those sectors because they know how to integrate nutrition and how to use their platform. I think both are some things to consider.
And so exactly, it's more effectively engaging with existing systems and expertise to scale these interventions. So it's not necessarily about reinventing the wheel here, is it?
Yes, that's right. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And perhaps I could just briefly ask for your view on adaptation for scale in terms of multisectoral interventions. Do the changes needed for scale square with a multisectoral approach? From your perspective, what are the sort of nitty-gritty implications for program design here?
I think that this is probably one of some of the areas where we haven't done a good job, but I think we tried in some of our areas. I think adaptation is one is, for adaptation, we need to understand, the peculiarity of specific sectors, because the way agriculture understand nutrition and how they can scale up nutrition is very different the way health system understand. So that understanding is important for adaptation. Two is there is also a geographic adaptation for me in addition to sector. I think Deborah mentioned the Tanzanian context, but I think we have that kind of experience in Ethiopia too, because when we wanted to scale up nutrient-sensitive agriculture, the intervention and the package we wanted to, scale up was not customized to the livelihood zones, which you don't get in health system. So we had to do some kind of documentation before we package the nutrition-sensitive intervention for different livelihood zones. So as understanding those contexts also is important for adaptation. The other one I would say is on social behavior change. I think we need to do a lot of adaptation for community social behavior change and community empowerment, so that most of our nutrition behaviors outcomes are due to change in behavioral outcomes. So if you want to do that one, I think we need to do a better job in terms of adapting our social behavior change approach at community level. I think a good example is the Bangladesh example. I think they tried that in Ethiopia too. And ours, the Swara approach, the first Swara one in Nepal, Save the Children implemented that project. We documented the documentation that was shared by Ellen. So they adapted the program for marginalized community. So I think those are some of the factors to consider.
No, thanks, Habtamu. Well, many thanks indeed. I'd now like to take a few questions that have come in from the audience. A question first on managing expectations. One audience member points out that different stakeholders have different expectations about the speed at which change might happen. So how do we recommend balancing these expectations around engaging stakeholders with the need to maintain quality, but on the other hand, also show results as quickly as possible? Perhaps, Deborah, we could turn to you first, and hopefully we're hearing you again loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you. So managing expectation, to me, I think, that we need to consider, and we should manage expectation when we are scaling up. And I'll give out my example. So for example, when you're coming with your program and you want to implement in a given area, when you share your plans, like people, like the government will say, okay, you would implement that like 100%. So they will have that expectation that maybe you will fund that 100%. And maybe partner around that area will say, okay, maybe this institution is funding that 100%. But if you are not managing that, and if you are not making them accountable to what they are supposed to do from the beginning, I think that will be a challenge. So to my case and my advice is that you need to communicate clearly during your initial strategic plan of what the expectations are and who should be accountable for what, so that everyone will do their what they are responsible for.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Now, turning to another topic, we've also had a few questions come in asking why the current approach isn't working. Why has there been so little progress? One audience member asks, seen with scaling and nutrition, despite so much funding being invested. Ellen, perhaps I could throw that one your way.
Okay, that's excuse me, an interesting question. I guess I would say I take a more optimistic view, especially after listening to the presentation and hearing that there are, in fact, quite a number of examples where things are working, that we need to focus on the success and what and why we have been able to achieve success. I know looking over the last 10 to 15 years, there actually has been quite a lot of progress, both in, certainly in certain outcomes in reducing undernutrition. So I would take a more positive view and say that quite a number of things are working and we need to learn from those. I can't remember what the second part of the question was. I apologize.
Yeah, so it was about it was about challenges, but also in spite of the funding being invested, that we've seen so little progress with scaling. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. I know I read somewhere that in one of the background pieces, there was a comment about that there's just a lot of funding being put toward nutrition. And I would challenge that to say that we don't actually know how much funding is being put toward nutrition. When you compare it from a donor lens as well to other sectors and other challenges, the funding isn't as big as one would imagine. And then when you look at how funding is spent, it often isn't being spent on the most impactful things. So I think we have this mantra that we work around in a lot of the things that we do, which is trying to use evidence and understanding of the challenge to get more money for nutrition, but then to get more nutrition for the money as well. And then more nutrition for the money means really focusing on how the dollars are getting used and being strategic about them in terms of both the types of things that get supported as well as the populations that are being reached that can be impacted. And so I would say, I would challenge the assumption that the thinking, I mean, we've been working on this problem for a very long time. There's no question of that. When you put it all together, yes, we've been spending money to try to solve the problem, but I don't think that we, when you look at other problems that have really, that are considered successes, that much more financial resources gone into that. Over.
Thanks, Ellen, for that optimistic note. Now, another question came in saying that both Deborah and Habtamu mentioned the need to simplify intervention packages. What does this look like in practice, and what nutrition interventions have you seen that have been simplified and then scaled? Habtamu, maybe I could come to you on that one.
Thank you. I think, for the health system, I think most of them are really very clear, and there are evidences and they are simplified. But I think for agriculture sector, for waste sector, I think we struggled a lot to simplify the intervention package for those specific sector. I think there has been a lot of progress for agriculture sector to, I think some documentation in progress to identify really which ones are really nutrition sensitive interventions that will have a good return for nutritional outcomes. But the other thing, I think we have also progressed a lot in terms of WASH sector based on the recent findings from the SHINE and other studies. So I think we are, the nutrition community and as well as the WASH community is looking into which WASH activities are important for nutritional outcomes. So I think we used to think that every WASH activity will have impact on nutritional outcomes. So those are some of the things I think we need to consider so that we simplify the intervention for the sectors so that they can scale it up in their delivery platforms.
Yeah, thanks, Habtamu. And Deborah, did you want to come in briefly on that as well? On the need to simplify intervention packages. I think the audience member was specifically looking for examples.
Okay, thank you. I think as Tam said, a lot of nutrition-specific intervention are kind of simplified, but we have challenge in incorporating nutrition-sensitive intervention, where I think most of nutritions, we are not very good at nutrition-sensitive. So at the end, you find we are kind of determining what nutrition-sensitive will implement to be able to reap in nutrition-specific sector. So I think, as Habtam say, and I agree, we need to work hand in hand for those sectors, for example, WASH, education, agriculture, to help us kind of getting through and understand which intervention should be implemented simpler at the community level to be able to help us with our nutrition out. Over.
Thanks, Deborah. And we just had another one come in. Ellen, you mentioned that there's an update to the framework on nutrition-sensitive and nutrition-specific actions ongoing. Could you say a few words about this? And obviously, as a journalist, we're interested in breaking news on Devex.com. Over to you.
Yeah, I put that out there as a little bit of a teaser, but for a very long time, people, and I think this conversation actually reinforces that notion that there's a lot of different ways that the idea of nutrition-sensitive interventions gets interpreted. And I don't think that there's going to be anything magical or new about this, but it's really reframing. It's an idea to put out there a framework that builds on the old framework, but makes it more specific based on what we've learned over the last few years about what it means to be nutrition sensitive. And it's specifically going to articulate both for undernutrition as well as some of the other transitional problems, nutritional problems, what exactly other sectors should be doing. What are the priorities? And this will all simply be based on the evidence. It'll be about the what and not about the how, but it'll attempt to give a little bit more specificity that people can go on when they want to say, this is what nutrition sensitive means. This is what we would like the different sectors to do. It will have to be a work in progress, and several of us are kind of iterating on it now and hope to put it out there for feedback and then get it published in 2020. And so that's the plan. We have Nutrition for Growth events in 2020. So we're just really trying to organize a lot of the thinking around preparing for that event and getting a strong commitment to continue to invest in nutrition and to scale impact. Over.
Many thanks, Ellen, and we will certainly be in touch. Stay tuned to Devex.com for more on that particular story in the new year. Many thanks to everyone for those responses. It looks like we're running extremely short on time. In fact, I think we're slightly over. So I'd just like to give a big thank you to Deborah, Habtamu, and Ellen for joining us today. And thanks to you, our online audience, tuning in across time zones. I think today's conversation has really been a valuable insight on how we can scale nutrition interventions effectively. And certainly it's been a really great addition to our ongoing Scaling Nutrition series, which runs until the end of January. Now, we've already published a number of articles and guest columns as part of the series, and we have a number of others currently in the works. To read that coverage, I'd encourage you to visit scalingnutrition.devex.com. That's scalingnutrition.devex.com, and have your say on social media, tagging @Devex and the hashtag #ScalingNutrition. We'll be in touch soon with a recording of this webinar, together with a copy of the presentations. But in the meantime, thank you again for your time today. And from here in Barcelona, all the best for the holiday season ahead.